What if I told you that right now, somewhere in the wilderness, there are places where the normal rules of reality simply don't apply? Places where tents move themselves in the dead of night, where strangers appear from nowhere with warnings you should have heeded, where counting marks on trees suggests something has been watching people for over 8 months, marking them like prey. These aren't urban legends. These aren't campfire stories meant to scare children. These are 3 accounts from real people who experienced something so deeply disturbing, so fundamentally wrong, that they've never fully recovered. I'm your host, and you're listening to Silent Fear, the podcast where the darkness doesn't just exist in imagination. It exists in the woods. It exists in those forgotten places where cell service dies and civilization feels like a distant dream. Today, I'm sharing 3 encounters that will make you question whether you should ever venture into the backcountry alone or with anyone at all. If you appreciate stories that burrow into your mind and stay there, please like, comment, and hit subscribe. We release horror content every single week. Now let's begin. Story 1. The Stone Circle. It was spring break during junior year of college. A young man and his 3 closest friends, Kevin, Allie, and Seb, decided to escape the confines of campus life for a weekend of car camping in the Colorado wilderness. They'd been taking these trips together since their freshman year. They were seasoned campers. They knew what they were doing, but that night, deep in the forest outside Buena Vista, they learned that some places have rules that exist far beyond human understanding. The narrator found their spot on one of those popular camping apps, the kind that specializes in free dispersed camping sites. The Forest Service road seemed to stretch on forever, winding deeper and deeper into isolation. The kind of path that makes you wonder if you're still on any official map at all. When they finally discovered the clearing near an old dried-up creek bed, they knew they'd found something special. No other campers, no recent tire tracks, no signs of human presence whatsoever. Just 4 friends and the endless Colorado wilderness stretching out in every direction. They set up their tents loosely around the clearing, maybe 15 feet apart from each other. Nothing sophisticated about the arrangement, just 4 tents positioned wherever the ground looked level enough and didn't have too many rocks. They drank some beers, played cards, and crashed around 11 o'clock at night. The narrator remembers thinking how tired he felt, exhausted in a way that didn't quite make sense given they'd only been there a few hours. And here's where the story takes its first dark turn. He didn't wake up once that entire night. Now you need to understand something crucial about this person. He's a light sleeper. Even in his own comfortable bed at home, surrounded by climate control and safety, he wakes up 3, 4, sometimes 5 times per night. Cold, needing the restroom, random anxieties. That's just how his body works. But that night he was dead asleep, the kind of sleep that feels like it was chemically induced, the kind of sleep that doesn't feel natural. When he unzipped his tent the next morning to get some fresh air, he froze completely. All 4 of their tents had been moved, not knocked over by wind or roughed up by an animal. Moved, deliberately repositioned. They were now arranged in a perfect square formation around a pile of stones that absolutely did not exist when they went to sleep. Each tent had been relocated somewhere around 20 to 30 feet from its original position. here's what really made his blood run cold. The stakes were still perfectly secured in the ground. Nothing inside any of the tents had been disturbed. His sleeping bag was exactly where he'd left it. His phone was still plugged into his portable charger. All his other gear was in the exact same spot. Nothing was missing. He thought he was going crazy. He yelled to wake up his friends. Kevin emerged from his tent first, and the narrator didn't even need to explain the situation. He could see it written all over Kevin's face. That same confusion, that same dawning horror. Allie and Seb crawled out moments later. As they looked around at the transformed campsite, the narrator watched their expressions shift from confusion to something far worse. But then something strange happened. Allie mentioned that she'd had this incredibly vivid dream about walking through a desert landscape while someone counted her steps out loud. Kevin chimed in, saying he'd had a dream about being in the army, marching alongside his fellow soldiers in perfect formation. Seb didn't remember having a dream. The narrator didn't either, but the coincidence made their skin crawl. And then came something even more disturbing. A feeling that none of them could quite articulate. It was almost like they were reading each other's minds. There was this weird vibe between the four of them. Hard to describe. It felt like they were more connected than they had been the night before, but in a bad way, a deeply unsettling way. The narrator remembers looking back and forth between his friends, trying to figure out what he was feeling in the air around them. The best way he could describe it was like there was a fifth person watching all of them. But that fifth presence was also somehow part of all of them, part of the group. They examined the campsite more carefully, looking for any clue that might help them understand what had happened. Kevin suggested maybe they'd just gotten really drunk and forgotten what they did. Maybe they'd moved the tents themselves in some kind of blackout state. This theory was shattered in about 5 seconds when they found the drag marks. There were clear trails in the dirt, leading from where each tent had originally been, positioned to where it now rested. But here's the thing that made their blood run absolutely cold. The drag marks stopped to about 10 feet short of each tent's final location, as if something had dragged them part way, then lifted and carried them the rest of the way. The pile of stones in the center was even stranger. There were exactly 4 stones, balanced on top of each other like some kind of sculpture or monument. It would have been pretty, actually, if not for the horrifying circumstances. Kevin walked over to get a closer look at the stone pile. As he was leaning in to examine the top stone, he tripped and ended up knocking the whole thing over. The stones tumbled to the ground. For a moment, all 4 of them just stood there in complete silence, staring at the scattered stones. And then things went from a 5 to a 10 on the fear scale. At the exact same time, and this is what still haunts the narrator, all 4 of them started hearing this low rumbling sound coming from somewhere in the distance. It sounded like rocks grinding against each other, not like an earthquake or a natural geological event, more like an ancient stone door being pushed open. Something heavy and deliberate. That sound sent them into a panic. They didn't discuss it. They didn't make a plan. They just started packing their belongings with pure primal urgency. It felt like they were reading each other's minds. That same disturbing connection that had formed that morning. And it applied to their feelings as well. They could feel each other's fear, and they knew the others could feel theirs. It was really freaky. 10 times freakier than it had been just 2 minutes before. The narrator doesn't think he's ever packed up a campsite so quickly in his entire life. Realistically, they were out of there in under 5 minutes. But in that moment, it felt like an eternity. That was 5 years ago now. Kevin moved to Denver after graduation. Allie's in graduate school in California. Seb moved to Chicago with his girlfriend. They keep in touch, but they've never really talked about that night since. Some things are too strange to process. Some experiences leave a mark that talking only makes worse. Some things are better left buried in memory, touched only in the darkest parts of night when you're alone with your thoughts. Story 2. The Warning. My name is Elias. This happened last summer when I was 23 years old. My girlfriend Hannah and I had been planning a camping trip for months. Just the two of us. No cell service, no distractions, no outside world. We'd been together about 1.5 years at that point, and honestly, things had been getting a little routine. Not bad. Just routine. We figured a weekend in the woods would be good for us. Might reignite something that had started to fade. We picked a spot in the URI National Forest in North Carolina. I'd spent weeks looking at different locations online, trying to find something that wasn't too crowded but also wasn't completely isolated. The place I settled on was this campground about 3 miles down, a Forest Service road. According to the reviews, it had maybe 6 or 7 campsites total, and they were pretty spread out from each other. We left Friday afternoon around 3 o'clock. We stopped for supplies at a grocery store near the forest entrance. We made it to the campground just before sunset. The road getting there was rough. Lots of potholes and loose gravel. But my truck handled it fine. When we pulled into the main clearing, I was honestly pretty satisfied with my choice. There were picnic tables scattered around, a couple of fire rings. The campsites themselves were tucked back into the trees enough that you'd have privacy from the other campers. We drove around slowly, checking out the different spots. Most were empty, which was good. We passed one site that had a blue sedan parked there, but I couldn't see anyone around it. Hannah pointed to a spot at the far end of the campground, right where the road dead-ended into the forest. It had a decent clearing for the tent and was positioned so that the trees blocked the view of all the other campsites. Perfect for us. We spent the next hour setting everything up. Hannah is one of those people who's really particular about how things are arranged, so I mostly just followed her instructions. By the time we were done, it was starting to get dark. I got a fire going while Hannah made sandwiches. For a while, everything felt exactly how it was supposed to. We were sitting there drinking beer, watching the flames, not really talking about anything important, just existing together, which I think was kind of the point of the whole trip. Around 10 o'clock at night, Hannah went to brush her teeth at the spigot near the picnic tables. I stayed by the fire, poking at it with a stick and finishing my beer. That's when I noticed someone. There was a man standing at the edge of our campsite, just beyond where the light of the fire reached. I jumped. I'm not gonna lie. I genuinely hadn't heard anyone walk up. Not a single sound. The guy apologized for startling me and said he was camped over in that blue sedan we'd seen earlier. He just wanted to introduce himself. His name was William, and he looked to be about 30 years old. There was this really intense way he had of maintaining eye contact that made me uncomfortable, but I obviously wasn't going to say anything about it. Hannah walked back toward us from the spigot, and I could tell from the way her body language shifted that she was not pleased with the interruption. William noticed her, and his entire demeanor changed. He said she'd picked a good spot, real secluded. He mentioned he was solo camping, trying to get away from people for the weekend, which seemed kind of contradictory since he was literally standing at our campsite making conversation. And here's the thing. The moment Hannah walked back, I didn't exist anymore. William's full attention was on my girlfriend. Not surprising, but definitely weird as hell. We talked for another minute or two. By we, I mean William talked at Hannah while she gave him awkward reply after awkward reply, clearly waiting for him to leave. Eventually, I cut in and told him we wanted to get some sleep because we were waking up early. That got him to finally leave. As soon as we walked into the darkness, I noticed he didn't use a flashlight or anything, which I thought was a little odd. How did he navigate in the dark without light? Hannah and I agreed about the weirdness of the whole thing and decided to try and forget about it. We stayed up for another hour or so, then put out the fire and went to bed. I don't remember falling asleep, but I do remember waking up. And the moment I woke up, I realized something was deeply wrong. It took me all of 3 seconds to realize I'd woken up to voices, somewhere in the distance, near our campsite. It sounded like 2 people having a conversation. I looked over and saw Hannah was fast asleep beside me. That's when the protective instinct in me kicked in. I didn't freeze or cower in the tent. I actually went out to investigate. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and poked my head out. The voices stopped almost immediately, like they had heard me, even though I thought I was being completely silent. As quickly as I could, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it around our campsite. But whoever had been there had either already left or was further away than I initially thought. Eventually, I went back inside the tent and tried to go back to sleep. It was a public campsite after all. People stay up really late on camping trips, so I didn't think it was anything threatening. I just hoped whoever had been out there got the hint to have their 3:00 a.m. talk somewhere far away from where I was trying to sleep. I didn't bother mentioning it to Hannah the next morning. I didn't really see the point in stressing her out over nothing. We spent most of the day hiking, which was a lot of fun and a decent workout, honestly. As the sun started to go down, I went to grab more firewood from a pile we'd made near the truck. That's when I noticed something on the windshield. It was a napkin folded in half and tucked under the wiper blade. I pulled it out and unfolded it, and I was shocked to discover that it was a note. A note saying, "You should move your tent." I obviously wasn't going to keep that to myself. So I showed Hannah the note and told her what happened the night before. When she saw the note, she immediately asked if it was William. I said, "I guess so, because who else would it be?" And as the two of us were discussing what to do next, obviously more than a little freaked out, as if on cue, William walked up to our campsite. He was wearing the exact same outfit as the day before, and looking at him filled me with a mix of rage and fear. The rage won, and I told him he needed to stop just walking up like that more aggressively than I probably should have. I was 100% convinced he was behind the note and the talking for the night before, and I wasn't going to let him think that he was fooling me. He said sorry in a gruff voice and said he was just checking up on us. Before I could respond, Hannah asked him why he'd need to check up on us and actually said something that really surprised me. He told us he didn't want to freak us out, but that he was surprised to see people as young as we were at the campsite. He said that there was a bunch of weird stuff that had been known to occur around here, freaky stuff. He said he'd found deserted campsites deep in the woods, signs of people, belongings, and other weird things. I didn't really trust a word he was saying, but he said it so matter-of-factly that part of me thought he was being genuine. He went on to say that he heard people walking around his car the night before, so he was going to cut his trip short and go home before the sunset. Then he advised us to do the same. At that point, I wasn't going to argue, and it's not like Hannah wanted to stick around either. So we all started packing our stuff. It was pretty stressful being as the sun was already almost set to begin with. I could tell Hannah was starting to freak out because her hands were shaking as she was putting stuff in the car, and I tried my best to calm her down. But I wasn't feeling great about things either. We finally finished getting everything in the car, and I started pulling out without another word. The sun was basically set at that point, and it would probably be fully dark in a few minutes. But as I was driving out, I noticed William's blue sedan was still in his campsite, which I found strange. I saw William crouched down near one of his tires, so I actually stopped my car. I asked him what he was doing, and he stepped back from his car to reveal a massive gash in the tire. Something that was definitely done deliberately. There was no question about it. Hannah said, "Holy." And I was pretty shocked to see it as well. I didn't know what to do. At first, he asked if I could give him a lift, but Hannah whispered that she wouldn't be comfortable with that. So I told him I couldn't, which led him to ask me if I would call the police for him as soon as I got service, and I told him I would. I pulled out of the campground and started down the dirt road. My headlights were on full blast. We were maybe 100 yards down the road when I glanced to my right and saw them. There were 3 figures standing in the woods, maybe 30 feet off the road. They weren't moving, and it didn't look like they were trying to hide either, almost like they wanted to be seen. I only saw them for a split second, but I was 100% sure they were people. And Hannah noticed them as well. My foot instinctively hit the brake. I don't even know why. Maybe some part of me thought I should go back and warn William, or maybe I was just trying to process what I was seeing. But before I could think it through, Hannah grabbed my arm and screamed at me to drive, like a genuine scream, so I did. Hannah didn't say anything the entire way back to the main highway. As soon as I got service, I pulled over and called 911. I told them everything, and the dispatcher said they'd sent someone to check on him. We never heard back from them. I wasn't really expecting to, but I had this sick feeling that something really wrong happened to William, and that I was partly to blame. Hannah tried to reassure me that he was in on the whole thing, which is a possibility, but I think that's just a way to cope more than anything. Either way, this is still something I think about from time to time. Story 3, The Counting. So, this was 2 days ago. I was 28 at the time, working remotely as an IT consultant out of Bozeman. The job wasn't anything special, but it paid okay. And being able to work from anywhere in the world was a huge plus for me. Unfortunately, I was going through kind of a rough patch at the time. I'd just gotten divorced about 3 months earlier, and I wasn't handling it well. Nothing I tried was working, and Believe me, I tried everything. It seems a little foolish and naive looking back, but at one point I was convinced I'd spend the rest of my life in misery, unless I did something drastic like go off the grid and spend a few weeks in the wilderness type drastic. So that's kind of what I did. Camping has always been a big part of my life, so trekking out in the wilderness all alone isn't actually as crazy as it sounds, at least for me. I'm actually a lifelong scout. Couldn't make Eagle quite in time. But the point is, I know my way around wilderness better than most. I've got my old man to thank for that. I didn't want to go anywhere where there'd be other people around, though. That would have defeated the whole point. I needed to be alone, so I did what any reasonable person does at 2 a.m. when they can't sleep. I went down the internet rabbit hole. Eventually I found this old Montana backcountry camping forum that had a bunch of posts about some unofficial sites in the Helena Lewis and Clark National Forest. So right then and there, I made the decision. The next morning, I planned everything out. The only person I told where I was going was my brother, and I didn't even mention the specific spot to him, just a vague description of the general area. I had a bunch of PTO saved up, so missing a week or so of work wasn't the end of the world. If I'm remembering correctly, that was a Tuesday, so it must have been a Thursday by the time I had my truck fully loaded up. I had enough supplies to last me the full week and then some. Freeze-dried meals, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, and all the other essentials. And of course, my Remington 700. I'm not a gun nut or anything, but you don't go that deep into the Montana wilderness without protection from wildlife. The drive out there was about 4 hours from Bozeman. First 3.5 were easy. Highway to county road to Forest Service road. That last bit though, what a headache. My GPS kept trying to reroute me because the service road I needed wasn't in its system. After some painful backtracking and double-checking the descriptions of some of those online posts, I found this overgrown trail that seemed to match up with what someone had written. Twice I had to stop to move branches and other debris that were blocking the path. My truck's a decent 4x4, but I was starting to worry about getting stuck. I drove along the path until it was impossible to go any further, at which point I just shut my engine. I knew I'd have to reverse out of there when the time came to leave. But I'd been prepared for that, so I wasn't too concerned. As soon as I stepped out of my truck, I was pretty confident I was in the right spot. But that far into the wilderness, there's not really a right spot since everything's as remote as everything else. Either way, I was pleased. There was a clearing not too far from the cluster of trees I'd parked in front of, and it looked like a perfect place to set up camp, except there was already a tent there. I noticed it almost immediately. It was this old olive green tent that looked like it was from the 1980s. My first thought was that someone else had found those coordinates, but the tent looked like it had been there for years. There was actual mold growing on the ceilings, like visible from 20 feet away kind of mold. I walked over out of curiosity. I probably shouldn't have, but whatever. I called out a friendly hello and waited. There was no response. The zipper was partly open, so I just unzipped it the rest of the way. And let me tell you, the smell in there was god-awful. It smelled like something had died inside. The stench was unbearable. But I was in too deep and was too curious to just walk away. I looked around the tent and saw an empty sleeping bag, some soup cans, and and a little notebook. I withstood the nastiness just long enough to grab the notebook and reach my head back into the pure air. There wasn't anything else in the tent besides what I already mentioned, so I didn't see the need to keep investigating, but something was making that smell, which I didn't really understand. But anyway, after stepping out of the tent, I started flipping through this little notebook and immediately realized what it is. Pages and pages of tally marks. There must have been hundreds of them in there, all in groups of 7. The last page had 42 groups, which is over 8 months. I wasn't really spooked at that point, more so curious and kind of excited to have stumbled upon my own little mystery. But after flipping through the notebook a few times, there wasn't really much else to do. I ended up keeping it. What was I going to do? Return it? But anyway, I decided to set up my own camp on the opposite side of the clearing, a decent distance away from the tent, but close enough to keep an eye on it. I didn't like the thought of letting it out of my line of sight. As I settled into the spot and acclimated myself with my surroundings, I realized there were no signs that anyone had actually camped here before. I went for a pretty extensive hike and didn't find any old fire rings, trash, trails, footprints, anything that would even marginally suggest another human. It was a really clear night that night. I remember that distinctly because the stars were incredible out there. The drive and setup had exhausted me, so I fell asleep pretty quickly. I woke up randomly in the middle of the night. I had no idea what time it was, but I knew for a fact I didn't wake up to nothing. I'm a very heavy sleeper, even out in the wilderness, so I knew something was wrong. I froze in the dark and listened, trying to hear for an animal or whatever else could have woken me up. And after about 30 seconds, I heard it whispers. It sounded like 2 or 3 different voices. And if I had to guess, I'd say they were maybe 20 feet from my tent. They were having some kind of conversation, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I was so freaked out, I started sweating. When you go that deep in the wilderness to be alone, the last thing you're expecting to stumble upon is another person, let alone multiple people. It doesn't sound like the scariest thing per se, but in the moment I was terrified. I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag, pretending to be asleep. The voices stopped, but I still didn't want to move. And after a few seconds, I started hearing footsteps around my tent. I realized whoever was out there was circling my tent the way an animal might. Instinctively, my hand went straight to my rifle, which turned out to be the correct decision because not 2 seconds later, someone started yanking on my tent zipper. When it didn't budge, thanks to the clips I'd put on, they pulled back. I had my rifle aimed directly at the tent flap, and a very strong part of me wanted to just fire right then. I was expecting the person messing with my tent to just leave, but no. They started scratching the flap like they were trying to cut their way in, and that's what sent me over the edge. I spoke up, saying I had a gun and to back the hell off. The scratching stopped immediately. There were a few seconds of complete silence, and then I heard footsteps. Multiple sets of footsteps running away in what sounded like different directions. It sounded like at least 3 people, which was somehow 10 times worse than the thought of it being just 2. They didn't all run the same way, which struck me as strange. I didn't sleep much that night, but I felt very safe with my rifle by my side. As soon as the sun rose, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, making a big show of brandishing my rifle. I immediately looked over at where the old moldy tent had been. It was gone. I walked over to the spot where I knew it had been. There was no ground depression, no stake holes, nothing. The grass wasn't even flattened, but I knew for a fact there had been a tent there. I had stared at it for hours the previous day. What I did find were footprints, bare human footprints, all around my campsite in a rough circle about 20 feet out. There were tons of them, and they were different sizes, which confirmed to me that there had been more than just 2 people out there. Some of them were also really deep, like whoever made them had been standing there for a long time. One set of prints led over to a big pine tree at the edge of the clearing. I walked over, and that's when I saw them. Fresh cuts in the bark. I knew what they were. Tally marks. 7 groups of 7 and the start of an 8th group. Just like the notebook. I just kind of stood there trying to make sense of it. The notebook had been counting something for over 8 months, and now there were fresh marks on this tree right next to my campsite. I didn't want to think about what that meant. It gets much, much worse though, because as I was backing away from the tree, I noticed something else. It was and still is the most disgusting thing I've ever seen. There was a dead squirrel hanging from a low branch a few feet away, tied up with what looked like a fishing line. I'm not squeamish about dead animals. I'm a hunter, for Christ's sake. But something about the way it was positioned made me want to puke. I didn't really need any more of an indication. I immediately ran back to my campsite and started packing my stuff as fast as I could. I'll admit that my hands were actually shaking while I took down my sight, and I was having trouble focusing on the task at hand without looking over my shoulder every few seconds. After what felt like forever, I finally finished packing everything and started jogging towards my truck. I threw everything in, jumped in the truck, and started backing out. Part of me thought my tires were going to be slashed or something else, but thankfully my truck was untouched. The path was narrow, and backing out was even harder than pulling in. So the ordeal was torture. It was hell, but I made it. And I don't think I was followed. By the time I made it back home, I decided I wouldn't even bother calling anyone. I did not think there was a point. Like, realistically, what would I even report? It's not like anyone would go that far into the woods to investigate. The thing that freaks me out the most is the sight of that squirrel. No one does that unless they're trying to send a message or a threat. I honestly don't know what would have happened if I stayed another night or if I hadn't been armed. So there you have it. 3 stories from 3 different campsites, all connected by the same unsettling truth. There are places in the wilderness that don't follow the rules we understand. Places where something is watching, something is counting, something is waiting. If you found these stories as disturbing as I do, please hit that like button, leave a comment below telling me which story freaked you out the most, and subscribe to Silent Fear for more encounters that shouldn't be forgotten, because some experiences follow you home, and some things, once you've seen them, you can never unsee them. Stay safe out there.